Thank you all so much for coming. I know it's not easy to get out on a Wednesday night in the middle of the week. So thank you for being here, especially for hearing about a work that's very much in progress. That's why I made the title of this in pencil so that it would come across. I have drawn about 144 pages of a 200 and maybe 60-page book. So there's a lot here to talk about already. And it will, if I make the deadline in February, come out in 2024. So let's see. All of this work is based on Eric Klein's 1177, the year civilization collapsed. It's this project came about through meeting Rob Tempio, who's the editor at a classics and archaeology conference a bunch of years ago, where I was making comics and showed them to him. He had also made this book come into being and said, after seeing my work, hey, why don't you work together with Eric? And I thought, oh no, well, let's see. And then eventually I read the book and began my work on it in the winter of 2020. So right as the pandemic hit, I began to work on the collapse of civilization. It seemed, as like Adam Gopnik says here, eerie relevance, maybe a little too much sometimes. So in order to, instead of telling you what this is about, I'm going to show you the introduction that I've added to Eric's book. Here it goes. In the late 12th century BC, my grandpa fought in an epic battle against the Egyptian army, one of many, and not only in Egypt. We swept across the eastern Mediterranean, leaving death and destruction in our wake. Come on, slide. We razed cities. I still smell the smoke. My grandpa, the warrior. We are the Peleset, one of several groups of so-called sea peoples. We're the best. I'm not quite old enough to remember, so Grandpa tells us how the battles went. Spoiler, not well. After our defeat, Ramses III settled us here in Egypt. But the trouble isn't over. The great powers of the late Bronze Age, the Hittites, Mycenaean, Canaanites, Cypriots, and others, have all fallen. We overran them all. And the international trade and royal gift exchanges of the last 3 centuries withered and disappeared, and civilization as we knew it came to an end. But why? 'Cause of us? That's what I aim to find out. In my day, we invaded first and asked questions later. How'd that work out for you, Grandpa? All right, Pell, you go and investigate. We'll defend the camp. But where will you go, Pell? First, I'll visit my friend Shesha in Luxor. It's a little slow. It's catching up. It's a long way to Luxor. You're friends with an Egyptian? Shesh is a scribe and will know the Egyptian side of the story and a lot more besides. While Pell is off solving the collapse, who wants to hear how we warriors took on the Egyptian army? Me! Our ships glided along the banks of the Nile. We spied the enemy's spears glinting behind the reeds. Did that stop us? No! Skipping forward to meeting Shesha, the scribe, and her family, who are artisans who work in Luxor at the temple of Ramses III. Dad, this is Pell visiting from, well, anyway, Pell's interested in recent history. Hello. Dad, tell him about our work on the temple. You tell him, Shesha, these epic reliefs won't carve themselves. Pell, this is Ramses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Ramses III is the pharaoh who fought the sea peoples. Exactly, we're carving the story on the north side. That explains the sea peoples all over it. Pell, our people fought on opposite sides. But we aren't enemies. Right, we'll crack this together. My dad and his team are inscribing the story in hieroglyphics. Here's the text for the sculptors to transfer to the wall. Read it for yourself. Can't. You don't read? We tell our stories out loud and leave no evidence of writing. No wonder you need me. The team is nearly done carving. I make sure they spell everything correctly. Big job. Actually, it's my brother's job. He went to scribe school and taught me everything. So this is the scene of the Egyptians fighting the invaders? One of several, and there were several groups of invaders. Dad, we're coming up for a closer look. Okay, careful on the ladders. I recognize these guys. They're the Peleset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Danuna, and Weshesh. This kid seems to know an awful lot about them. Maybe he can tell us where they come from and why they went out of their way to attack. I heard they could be from as far away as Sicily, Sardinia, the Aegean, Western Anatolia, and Cyprus, but no one place has been identified as their home. We do know when they attacked. It was during the 8th year of Ramses III's reign. The year was 1177 BC. Okay, so that's to introduce my characters and the situation of 2 kids, a Sea People kid, an Egyptian scribe, who will take us through this story of discovering what it was that caused their world to fall apart. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about Eric, and then I'm going to talk about myself and how I got to this place where I'm immersed in this project. And then I'll read the end of the prologue that sets up what the rest of the book will be about, and a few other short stories from the next chapter. So the structure of this book I'm following almost exactly, except for the addition of these ancient characters. And this book is mostly about the 3 centuries before the collapse and building up the connections between the different societies so that then when they come apart, it's even more devastating. Eric Klein is an archaeologist with a lot of field experience. He was a co-director at Megiddo in Israel and currently at Tel Kabri in Israel. He's worked at a lot of other places and published other books. These are the most recent ones, including this one, 3 Stones Make a Wall, which I illustrated in 2017, including this image of Funky Tut. King Tut's getting a lot of press right now because it's the centenary of his discovery, and that makes me happy. About me, here's my character in the book, and me about this time of year. But when I was in high school, back in the Bronze Age, I've been interested, or obsessed rather, with Egypt for about this long and earlier. And I think one of the things that I love about the Egyptian world and Egyptian art is that their use of iconography, images with text. And that sounds a lot like comics, which is what I've devoted myself to for the past at least 10 years and before, but in earnest in the past 10 years. So here are a few books that I published since 2017. And the last 2 in 2019. And 20 years before that, I had this Fulbright Fellowship to Cyprus and published these 2 books about Cypriot sites and these cartoons of Cyprus, where I really felt like I could play with what it was like to live there, where you're eating octopus and looking at ancient illustrations of those on pottery, so that they feel like they came to life like as you ate them. Living in Cyprus allowed me to travel and work on excavations around the region. So this is from 2019, where I went with the University of Cyprus students to Syria and Palmyra. I really hate to think of what this place looks like now, but I'm very grateful to have the chance to go there and get a sense of the places that appear in this book. After that Fulbright ended, which was sad, of course, I stayed on in the region and worked as an illustrator on excavations, including at Troy in Turkey, Trojan War, Troy, and at Knossos and on Kythera, and a lot of sites in Cyprus and in Syria and Lebanon also. But the site that I've gone back to most often is Cancri, which is the eastern port of ancient Corinth. It was the place where St. Paul would have sailed in to preach to those sinful Corinthians. But I've worked there for maybe 10 years, discontinuously, but drawing pottery, a much different kind of drawing. These are technical, kind of analytical drawings. People always ask, why not just photograph the stuff? And of course they do that too. But here's a drawing of a Roman glass bottle, which would have had a tall neck, two non-joining pieces, but you can tell from taking the interior diameter with a little diameter chart that this is a bottle that is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 centimeters across. And if you know the shape of Roman glass bottles from the 2nd or 3rd century AD, well, yep, they come together and make this little thing that was probably found in a tomb and full of fancy perfume. So I loved this working in as an illustrator in archaeology, but it left very little time for making comics or books. And by this time I had met John, who's right here. Here's his book, Coniris the Divine Liar, which I illustrated about 50 illustrations of the kind where you don't have to leave the house to do, because I was working from photographs. And so continuing on that and illustrating Eric's book has led to more work in illustration, but at the same time I was experimenting with making my own comics. Because I'd published that book in Cyprus of cartoons, those are almost all only single panel cartoons. And I really didn't know how to put comics together into panels and tell a story in sequence. And this was John's idea, because coming up with a story, writing it, and drawing it is really hard. I decided to use these Homeric hymns. I did 3 of them, and use them as sort of training ground and a fun way, a way to play with learning how to portion out a story into panels and placement of text and composition in order to tell a story in comics. So these are panels from this, which I think I did in around 2012, so 10 years ago. And it was this project that I showed to Rob Tempio, who said, how about making Graphic 1177? And also, how about making a book of Homeric hymns, which would be another big job. I was also working on comics of my own by this time. So this is the cover of a book that won a prize at a festival in New York. It's about 100 pages about my first trip to Greece and how I got so very, it's how archaeology became real. And I knew that it was something that I could work in and experience in the landscape. It's also about a friendship that has endured since this time took place when I was in grad school in the 90s. And exploring like the connections of mythology and landscape with archaeology. But after doing this book and winning a prize and feeling like I will, like this is the direction I'm going to take, I got an email from James Sturm, actually while I was working in Greece on the dig, asking me if I would like to make a book with the Center for Cartoon Studies presents series of graphic biographies. They've published books on Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller. The latest one is on Harriet Tubman, and it's very beautiful. And that was an email I couldn't refuse. So this was published in 2019. I worked on it for maybe 2 years. It's Little Brown, and again, working closely with an editor, which I hadn't done before in my own comics. I was just adding a page and a page and a page whenever I felt like it. And so the story could expand infinitely. And that is great. And it's also like, it's better for more concise storytelling to have a beginning and an end that you know will happen on page 89, whether you like it or not. So this book really helped me be able to both condense and be very specific about what each page was doing. Here's page 1, and to work from research material and create a book, a story out of like thousands of pages of not only novels, but the things the Brontes wrote before they wrote the novels, letters, and other documents, including like the top panel is taken from a drawing that Charlotte herself did of this school in the 1820s at some point. 1830s, how about? I also went from not always using a panel grid to definitely using a panel grid, and that also really helped keep track of what I was doing. I would write on the top of each page what that page was about. So each page had its own title. This one was the bad day at school, and Charlotte gets in trouble for telling a story. Also working, because most of what I had done before, a lot of what I had done before related to the ancient world. The 19th century has a lot more stuff. So I could use photographs, engravings, and of things as they were. On the right side, these are 2 of very few photos of a street in Belgium that exists no longer, but I used everything that I could for this book. As well as this is a scene of Charlotte's teacher telling her what's what, and so portioning out the text so that it's not too overwhelming, so no one stops reading because there's too much text. I don't know if that's succeeded, but it's an ongoing process. At the same time, being immersed in Charlotte's world, I started to have ideas that I submitted to the New Yorker about how I could solve 19th century literature if only everyone had birth control. So here's the first page of this, and there's many others that I solved it for Wuthering Heights and Madame Bovary and Pride and Prejudice. They're up, it's online. Also, probably earlier than this, Andy Kolovos asked me to make one of these small comics that are now collected in The Most Costly Journey, which is the Vermont Reads Book of the Year. This was completely out of my experience at that time, and really a wonderful project that I'm so glad and grateful to be involved in, where they gave me the script of an interview with someone who wasn't named Anna, that had been translated from Spanish about her experience of being a migrant worker and having a baby in Vermont. Yet again, another opportunity for telling a story portioned out through design and panel structure. This one, unlike using ink and very much black and white, these little booklets were printed in both English and Spanish and distributed to migrant worker centers in rural Vermont, because it comes from a tradition of small comics that exist in Latin America, Peggy, that in order to share stories, say like, you're not alone with an experience. I really love, I loved being involved in this. So back to 1177, because speaking of migrants, the Sea Peoples probably were. I'm going to go back to reading now. It's funny to see, because I've taken Eric's voice and I've given it to this character, and I think finding the balance between the authority of an archaeologist who knows, has the site from this time period to someone in the past, but so it's a funny. By this time, you've read that, so I'm going on. I told you not to drive into battle. How would we know the Egyptian army would attack families? But maybe we're more likely victims than aggressors. Maybe we were forced out by hardships in our homelands and migrated eastward, where we encountered empires already in decline. This place looks nice. The drought and famine seem not so bad here. But who's in charge? Maybe no one. I'm going to look for a cafe. Cuckoo, anyone home? In some areas, Sea Peoples attacked and conquered. We're going to stay, and I'll fight anyone who tries to stop us. If there's a weakened monarchy, we'll topple it. Maybe we don't need to attack. Yeah, we could share resources. Look, we have company. Welcome to Canaan. Staying long? Darn, we can't attack now. Will these kind people let us stay without a fight? Come in, sit down, have a drink. Go on, twist my arm. Gods, they're such opportunists. It's the 12th century BC. Who isn't? Maybe the Sea Peoples settled in the Eastern Mediterranean more peacefully than it's been previously assumed. Wonderful food, thank you. You're most welcome. We'll explore the possibilities around the Sea Peoples' arrival in greater detail in the following pages. Cheers to our new friends. Crash. Watch out. They may have been responsible for some of the destruction that occurred at the end of the Late Bronze Age. I can't look. Help, fire. Oops, sorry. But it's far more likely that a concatenation of events, both human and natural, brought the Late Bronze Age to an end. The end of the prologue that sets up the investigation of the book begins with chapter 1, the 15th century, and looking at a series of stories that all work to prove that the building up of interconnections between, for example, in this image, Crete and Egypt, where this is a reconstruction of an ancient painting that was found in micro bits in a heap in a site called Tel Daba in the Nile Delta, and it's very clearly done in the style of Minoan artists who would have to either train Egyptian artists or make the trip from Crete in order to paint this palace. Why would a pharaoh who has plenty of good painters of his own employ people from far away? And I think the answer can only be something like prestige. How cool would it be to see a painting in an entirely different style, and also done in a technique that, unlike the Egyptians, peeled off the wall and fell into chunks in a very short amount of time, because they used lime plaster and the Egyptians didn't. And so the occurrence of this painting and a few others in other sites in the Eastern Mediterranean is just one piece of a large picture of trade and international contacts that happened starting in the 15th century. But first, I'm going to tell you more about how I put these images together. So back in 2020, there's nothing else to do but print out the prologue and Act 1 of Eric's book that he sent me and start marking it up and plotting out where things would go. So I got a ream of 11 by 17, that's kind of confusing with the title, paper, and ruled out all the pages to be exactly the size that will be printed, which is 10 by 7. And I wanted to do this in page spread so that I could make big images that went across the page. So here's some of the thumbnails for chapters. They don't look like much. And so here's a thumbnail for pages 18 to 19, where I was really plotting out what goes where. Page 19 comes from this sentence right here. There's too much text, you can't read it. But the point was that that across this time period and places, something about this paragraph, this sentence, made me think of a single site that was thriving, then was under attack, then was ruins, and then was gone. So that was the concept for this page, in a sequence that's very simple, but the text would spread across it. So my next step is to pencil this, like draw it again in pencil on 11 by 14, but as a single page with a page template underneath. And then I would draw it again on Bristol, so it's like thicker paper, and this is a final drawing. A lot of cartoonists draw their final drawings in ink, like that's called inking, like what you're supposed to do. But since the Brönte book, I started drawing, like inking in pencil, and that was really fun because you can make gradations and texture that is much different from ink. And if you screw up, you can erase it and don't have to get any white out. And like it's still there. You can see it. But the next step is to scan it and put it into Photoshop. And I have a page template that is the book size plus a bleed, because sometimes the ink will run off the edge. So scan that in, set it up in the template. And clean up all the smudges and stuff that I've created because this is in pencil. And then I figured out that I can export this file to Procreate and color on an iPad Pro, which is portable. And I feel very torn as someone with a MFA in painting to like sync all these pixels into the who knows where. But it's actually kind of fun. And so I've tried to do this on, some people use many layers. I've tried to use 2. This one has 3 for some reason. I think it was early days. So there's blue, there's gold. The panel borders makes it look more cleaned up. By then I'd added the characters having a conversation. In Photoshop, I do the balloons, and then in InDesign, the text. And this is, I know, it's like four programs. It's killing me, man. I used to do very spontaneous, free comics on paper and scan it and slap it in a book and call it good. But no, this project, because I've been through so much editing with this, and I know that I'll have input both from Eric and from the press when the copy editors get a hold of it. I think being able to type in a font that I paid for theoretically will save time. I'm not convinced, but yeah. So this looks done. Haha, it's not. I've sent each chapter to Eric. Eric's job is an author, not a copy editor. As I've said to him, don't worry about my bad spelling. You know, somebody else will. He said, I can't stand it, and I'm not leaving it. He's copy edited journals, so he can't leave it out. But I'm very grateful to him for that. So here's my printout of Eric's notes and my checklist that I noticed aren't checked off, but I think I've made these changes. So I'd go through the printed out copy because you sure see a lot more things to change on paper than on the screen, at least, yeah, for me. So here's a page from the middle of the prologue that's pretty text heavy because all of this text is what Ramses has inscribed on the walls of the temple. And how do we know this? Because it comes from right here in this. Here's a photo of the temple wall, and see that sort of smudgy bit in the center that looks much more detailed? That is that image of all the battle with ships in it that you can't tell from here. This is, I've relied on this records of Ramses III because it's pretty chewed up in real life. And so these are all images that I've used as source images for stuff, including this. You can barely see. These are Egyptian army guys whacking some poor innocent sea peoples in their cart. And that's where this image comes from, or something like it, and I flipped it around so that it would make more sense in this context. But there's a page spread in this where Eric describes how valuable this transcription of Medinet Habu is. Because it was eroded in the 1950s, and I think it just keeps on going. So here it is again. Here's an image from that giant battle of sea peoples, and you can see in the lower corner the guy facing down with his horned helmet, drowning. Here's another one with this guy falling out of the ship, right in the middle. This is like a conglomerate. Here's directly from this image of those, dang, they're so mean. More captive sea peoples. And where's the image from the Ramses III Sea Peoples town is from another image from somewhere on this temple with those cute rounded crenellations. So it's just one image of, like even one page takes the research of pulling together images of how I can use, and don't even, and also it's pretty funny how if you Google bulldozer Hattusha, like Turkey, now I suddenly get a lot of ads for like construction equipment from Turkish sources. I like tricking the algorithm like that. This is a pause to, we're doing pretty well on time, right? Yes, that's slow too. And actually time is going slower while I'm up here, just because I'm talking about the past. I'm very happy to answer any questions about this and say anything that I've left out. There are two tiny little stories left that come from chapter 1. This is an image to set up the first one about how the Hyksos, a group of foreigners who came from the area of Canaan, perhaps, and ruled Egypt and captured this, let's see, ruled Egypt before 1550 BC, when the Egyptians kicked them out and got their country back. But before that comes a little story that may be apocryphal and may be after the fact. But first, a story from the time of Hyksos rule that records a disagreement between the Hyksos king and an Egyptian ruler, the quarrel of Apophis and Seknen-Re. So the Hyksos were ruling in the Nile Delta, and there was another capital in Egypt down the Nile where Egyptians still kept some rule, but the Hyksos were really in charge, and it's called the second intermediate period. Is that right? Yes. And so chapter 1 begins with this at the point where the Hyksos are kicked out and Egypt begins to thrive. How am I, Apophis, king of the Hyksos, supposed to rule Egypt without a good night's sleep? Roar! It's the fault of the Egyptian ruler, Seknen-Re. His hippos bellow all night long. Roar! Seknen-Re, if you can't make your hippos quiet down, I'll bash your head in with an axe. Apophis is preposterous. My hippos are 200 miles away up the Nile from him. There's no way he can hear you, my beauties. He's just bothered that I'm ruling simultaneously. When archaeologists recovered Seknen-Re's mummy, they found a gash in the skull made by a battle axe. I warned you, Seknen-Re. Okay, the last one is an unusual instance of returned Minoan shoes. So this is a jump back further in time, also though to illustrate how cultures had been in contact and trading with each other even before this, the 1500s BC, because this one takes place in 1770 BC. So those trade routes had been open a long time. To pause to say, one reason that this book is about those trade connections is for a long time in the history of archaeology, scholars denied that it could be possible that cultures were in contact this early. And so these stories set up a reason to say, yes, they were in contact. I've come from King Zimri-Lim of Mari. I'm bringing you a valuable gift, King Hammurabi. Put down your law code and open it. It's from Crete. Shoes? They've made a long journey. Humph. You'd think the guy who wrote An Eye for an Eye would accept fancy Minoan shoes. He could at least have re-gifted them to another king of equal rank and smaller feet. Gift-giving between kings was a well-known practice as part of a diplomatic embassy. Evidence for re-gifting includes a letter from Hittite king Hattusili III to another ruler stating, I have taken a raiton of silver and a raiton of pure gold from the gift of the king of Egypt and sent them to you. These are worth a fortune, but that they come from Pharaoh, that's value. So I haven't colored those guys yet. Work in progress. Speaking of Pharaoh, so this is just a shot of another part of this that I think is charming to imagine, or is it? Egypt cultivated a cordial relationship with Mitanni. In less than half a century, by the time of Amenhotep III, relations between Egypt and Mitanni were so improved that he married not one, but two Mitannian princesses. These are marriages of international diplomacy. Our world is becoming so interconnected. And that's another part that's eerily relevant, and especially that we saw during the pandemic, where when supply chains are too interconnected and too distant and they're cut off, suddenly you can't get the things you need. And so this is another way of saying that might be a contributing factor to this collapse in the late Bronze Age. If trade routes were no longer viable, people couldn't get, for example, tin that they needed to make bronze. That would, it would shrink their economy and their ability to both fight and plow and whatever else they were using bronze with. Here's a guy named Kellia, emissary of one of those Mitannian princesses. We've jumped forward to chapter 2. And this is grayed out because I'm still working on it. And he's saying we're just getting started, which is how I'm ending this. Continue. So thank you very much to all of these. Thank you for having me. Thanks for coming out. And the end. I'm going to go back to this.